A family trip to the wildlife park typically promises a perfect getaway. Still, for a father grappling with financial crisis and personal issues, the outing took a disastrous turn when he recklessly shoved his young son into the bear enclosure. What happened next would leave everyone talking. Robert had been under a dark cloud for months, with financial burdens creeping into every corner of his life and suffocating any moments of peace. Work had slowed, bills piled up, and creditors called more frequently than he could ignore. To make matters worse, his relationship with his 10-year-old son, Ethan, was strained. Robert's temper flared often, and their once easygoing rapport had dwindled into tension-filled silences and petty arguments. Ethan, increasingly glued to his tablet, retreated into a digital world, gnawing at Robert's already frayed nerves. The family trip to the wildlife sanctuary had been his wife's idea, a forced attempt at normalcy and a break from the suffocating atmosphere at home. Nestled deep in the wilderness, the sanctuary boasted a massive grizzly bear population, but Robert's mind was elsewhere. He barely registered the towering trees or the crisp air, consumed by thoughts of the trip's cost and how his life seemed to slip further out of control. Ethan remained disconnected, absorbed in his tablet instead of the wildlife around him. Robert's frustration grew with every step they took on the guided tour. As they approached the Grizzly enclosure, Robert's eyes darted to Ethan, who walked beside him, oblivious to everything. It felt like a mosquito buzzing near his ear, the pressure mounting. Inevitably, the argument erupted, fueled by exhaustion and guilt. Robert snatched the tablet from Ethan's hands, muttering about responsibility. His anger masked deeper frustrations, and Ethan snapped back, defensive and hurt. Their exchange escalated quickly, drawing the attention of other families while the guide continued discussing the bears, oblivious to the growing tension between father and son. It happened so quickly, in one of those impulsive flashes of anger that make no sense in hindsight. Robert, frustrated beyond reason, shoved Ethan lightly toward the railing of the Grizzly enclosure. It wasn't meant to be anything serious, a gesture to shake the boy out of his defiance, to make him realize the reality of the situation, to snap his attention back to the present. But in that instant, Robert forgot about the ongoing maintenance issues at the sanctuary, issues that had been briefly mentioned during the tour but had barely registered with him. The railing gave way slightly under Ethan's weight. A moment later, everything fell apart. The commotion startled the bears, and the closest one, an enormous creature with matted brown fur and a scar running down its side, rose to its full height. In a single terrifying motion, it lumbered toward the weakened section of the fence. The bear moved with shocking speed for something so significant, and in an instant, it was through the compromised barrier, standing just a few yards from Ethan, who had stumbled forward in confusion and fear. The sanctuary staff, stunned for a moment, began shouting and scrambling to contain the situation, but chaos erupted as the crowd screamed and scattered. In that instant, the world seemed to stop for Robert. The blinding fury that had gripped him moments before vanished, replaced by an all-consuming terror. He had pushed his son toward danger, toward something uncontrollable, something lethal. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding in front of him. The massive grizzly, now entirely outside its enclosure, was fixated on Ethan, its dark eyes gleaming with a primal intensity. Robert acted on pure instinct. He rushed forward, his heart pounding in his chest, desperate to place himself between his son and the bear. His hands trembled as he grabbed Ethan, pulling him backward, the boy's small frame rigid with fear. The bear took a step closer, its snout twitching as it sniffed the air, drawn in by the panic and confusion. Everything became a blur of movement and sound. The sanctuary staff shouted instructions, alarms blared, and visitors ran in every direction. Robert barely registered any of it. His focus was entirely on the bear and the small, fragile boy in his arms. The bear's movements were slow and deliberate, almost as if it was weighing its options, testing the air for a moment before deciding whether to pursue. But then, with a final shuddering growl, the bear turned, distracted by the noise and confusion around it, lumbering back toward the open gate of its enclosure. Sanctuary workers, finally regaining control, began ushering the animal back inside with loud noises and the clanging of metal barriers. Within moments, it was back behind the reinforced gate, locked in again, but the damage was done. Robert collapsed to his knees, still clutching Ethan tightly. His heart was pounding and his mind was spinning in a storm of guilt and self-loathing. What had he done? In a moment of thoughtless anger, he had put his child in mortal danger. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. In the days that followed, the incident became a topic of local news. Questions were raised about the sanctuary's safety protocols, but the scrutiny that weighed heaviest on Robert wasn't from the public or the media. It was from within. He couldn't shake the image of Ethan, small and terrified, inches from the bear, or the horrifying thought of what might have happened. It wasn't just the physical danger that haunted him, but the deeper understanding of how disconnected he had become from his son. The sanctuary conducted a full investigation, and Robert was called in for questioning. But the only judgment that truly mattered to him now was his own. He knew he had to make amends, not just for the terror he had caused, but for the months, years even, of emotional distance, of letting his struggles close his eyes to his role as a father. In the aftermath of the incident, Robert made a decision. He would rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was long, but for the first time in months, he felt clarity. His anger, his frustration, his financial worries, they all paled in comparison to the responsibility he had nearly lost forever. The sun hung low in the Alaskan sky, casting a golden hue over the sea as a yacht sliced through the water. 6 friends, Maya, Lucas, Jenna, Tyler, Claire, and Sam, set out for what they envisioned as an idyllic getaway. With wind tousling their hair and laughter echoing over the waves, they felt invincible, unaware of the dark fate ahead. Their journey took a turn when an unexpected storm rolled in. Dark clouds gathered ominously, and the wind picked up with alarming ferocity. The yacht, once a vessel of freedom, became a toy in nature's relentless grip. Panic spread through the group as the captain struggled against the elements. A monstrous wave struck, capsizing the yacht and throwing the friends into the frigid waters. When Maya regained consciousness, she found herself washed ashore on a remote Alaskan island, disoriented and alone. Struggling to her feet, she scanned the beach and saw her friends scattered but alive. Relief washed over her, mingled with dread as the reality of their situation sank in. Stranded on an island teeming with wildlife and far from civilization, they had only the tattered remains of their yacht and each other. As the adrenaline faded, the group huddled together, acutely aware of their vulnerability. The island loomed before them, dense with dark green trees and underbrush, promising both shelter and danger. They decided to venture into the wilderness, hoping to find resources and a path back to civilization. In the days that followed, they scrambled for survival. They built a makeshift shelter from fallen branches and scavenged for food. Berries, roots, and occasional shellfish provided scant nourishment, but the threat of grizzly bears loomed larger with every rustle in the underbrush. Maya took the lead, organizing watch shifts and assigning tasks. Tyler gathered firewood, Claire identified safe berries, and Lucas and Jenna scavenged the yacht wreckage. As evening fell, the sun dipped behind the peaks, and the forest transformed into a labyrinth of shadows, intensifying their growing fears. The initial hope of rescue began to dim, replaced by the realization that they might be alone for an extended period. The sounds of the island were unrelenting, the cries of seabirds, the rustling of leaves, and the distant growls of something far larger than themselves. It wasn't long before they spotted their first grizzly, a massive creature with a thick coat of fur and a gaze that seemed to pierce through the trees. The bear lumbered across the clearing, indifferent to the human's presence, its sheer size making it a living embodiment of nature's power. Fear rippled through the group, binding them together in a collective terror. Each encounter with the bear left them shaken, forcing them to adapt. They constructed noise-making devices from pots and sticks to scare off the animals, and their watch shifts became more frequent and tense. Nights were filled with the haunting sounds of the wild, and every crackle of a branch sent them into a frenzied state of alert. Days turned into a blur of survival, and soon their unity began to fray. Disagreements over food rations and responsibilities simmered just below the surface. Lucas, in particular, grew increasingly anxious, feeling the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. His ideas for escape clashed with Maya's more cautious approach. Jenna and Claire often sided with Lucas, believing they should take more risks to find help, while Tyler and Sam preferred to fortify their camp and avoid confrontations with the bears. One fateful night, the tension boiled over. Lucas, frustrated with the slow pace of their efforts, decided to venture out alone in search of help. Despite the warnings from Maya and the others, he slipped into the darkness, determined to prove his worth. Hours passed, and anxiety gnawed at the rest of the group as they awaited his return. The moonlight illuminated the treetops, casting eerie shadows that danced in the night. Suddenly, a bone-chilling roar shattered the stillness, followed by the sound of crashing branches. Panic surged through the group as they scrambled to gather their makeshift weapons, hearts racing at the thought of what might be unfolding in the woods. A few tense moments stretched into eternity as they waited for Lucas to return. Then, through the gloom, they saw him, a dark figure stumbling toward them, wild-eyed and panting. He was covered in scratches and dirt, his clothes torn. Behind him, the hulking shape of a grizzly followed, drawn by the scent of fear. The friends sprang into action, brandishing whatever they could find, sticks, rocks, and their voices, attempting to intimidate the predator. The bear stood its ground, snorting as it assessed the group. Time seemed to freeze as they faced the creature, primal fear coursing through their veins. It shifted, muscles rippling beneath its fur, and suddenly charged. The friends, hearts pounding in sync, screamed and brandished their weapons, but the sheer force of the bear sent them sprawling. The struggle that ensued was chaotic and brutal. Maya instinctively grabbed a thick branch and swung it at the bear, aiming for its head. Lucas joined her, desperately striking the creature back while Tyler and Claire hurled stones, their hearts racing in the fight for survival. The bear reared back, momentarily dazed, giving the friends a crucial chance to retreat toward their shelter, adrenaline fueling their escape. Breathless and trembling, they reached their makeshift camp, but the bear followed, undeterred. Banding together, they found strength in their desperation. They lit a fire, its crackling flames casting flickering shadows, and shouted in unison to fend off the predator. Hesitating, the bear seemed to sense their solidarity and retreated into the night, leaving the shaken group united by their primal experience of survival. As they huddled close to the fire, warmth provided a semblance of safety. They had faced the raw power of nature and emerged, if only just, on the other side. The struggle had forged an unbreakable bond among them, each sharing an understanding that transcended words. With dawn painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they gathered to plan their next steps. They pooled their knowledge and strengths, determined to navigate their new reality. In the following days, they worked tirelessly, setting traps for fish and gathering sustainable food sources. Mapping the island, they scouted potential escape routes, learning to coexist with the bears by avoiding their territories. As weeks passed, they transformed fear into determination. The island, once a place of despair, became a sanctuary that tested and strengthened their bonds as they awaited rescue, acutely aware of nature's beauty and brutality. The Canadian Rockies stretched endlessly before the team, a stunning expanse of jagged peaks, dense forests, and icy rivers. Dr. Emma Reed, a seasoned wildlife biologist, led the research team, accompanied by David, a robust field ecologist, and Sophie, a promising young research assistant. Their expedition aimed to study grizzly bear behavior in this remote part of the Rockies, a project fueled by curiosity and a desire to contribute to conservation efforts. They came equipped with advanced technology, drones, motion sensor cameras, GPS trackers, and a portable lab to ensure a non-invasive study. After a week of meticulous camp set up on the edge of a valley rich in bear activity, the team was eager to begin their observations. Bear sightings had been frequent but always from a distance, as magnificent creatures lumbered through the underbrush, sniffing the air or foraging for food. The researchers excitedly noted patterns of movement, diet, and territorial behavior. However, as days passed, the bears began to show signs of discomfort. Tracks found near the camp were getting closer. Fresh scat appeared around their perimeter, and several bears lingered in areas they typically passed quickly. The team realized they were intruding into the bears' habitat, yet they believed their methods were safe, rationalizing that they were merely observers in this wilderness. On the 10th day, tension escalated when David ventured deeper into the forest to set up additional motion cameras. The air felt heavy with an unsettling stillness. After 2 hours without a word from David, Emma and Sophie exchanged worried glances. Though they reassured themselves of David's experience, anxiety gnawed at them as the minutes stretched into hours. Suddenly, the drone feed showed a bear, one much larger and more aggressive than the others they had been observing, moving swiftly in David's direction. The massive creature's hackles were raised, its gait urgent and agitated. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This was different. This was not a bear going about its routine. Something had provoked it, and they all knew it. The cameras caught the moment the bear broke into a full charge. The images were disjointed, frantic, and unclear, but it was evident that David hadn't seen the animal approaching until it was too late. Emma's heart pounded as she stared helplessly at the screen, watching the bear's immense frame closing in on David's position. Then, the feed cut off. Time slowed to an agonizing crawl in the moments that followed. Emma and Sophie scrambled to piece together what had happened. They called out on the radio, desperately trying to reach David, but there was only silence. They grabbed the bear spray and rifles they had brought for emergencies, though their hands shook with the knowledge that they might already be too late. When they found David, the forest around them had transformed from a serene wilderness into a battlefield. His body was still, crumpled in the ferns, his jacket torn apart, blood seeping into the earth. The bear was gone, but the aftermath was brutal. Emma stood frozen, the horror of the scene suffocating. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what had happened set in. The attack was swift and merciless. They had been studying these creatures, watching them from a safe distance, thinking they could predict their behavior. But nothing could have prepared them for the violence of nature unleashed. David's knowledge of the bears, his caution, had not been enough. They had crossed an invisible line, becoming not just observers, but intruders in a world that did not belong to them. The hours following the attack were a blur of fear and grief. Emma's mind raced, torn between the need to process the shock of David's death and the urgent question of what to do next. They were isolated, miles from the nearest town with limited satellite contact. More terrifying still was the knowledge that the bear that had attacked David was likely still nearby, its territory disturbed, its aggression possibly not yet spent. Emma knew they couldn't abandon the research, even in the face of tragedy. David's death had not just been a loss, but a grim reminder of the stakes involved in their work. The mission, after all, had been about understanding the very creatures that had claimed his life. But now it was also about survival, how to navigate the thin line between study and intrusion, and how to make it out alive. They set up additional cameras and surveillance equipment, meticulously scanning for signs of bear movement. Every sound in the forest became magnified in their minds, a branch snapping, the rustle of leaves. Paranoia crept in, and every movement felt like a harbinger of another attack. Emma knew that letting fear rule them would be their undoing, but the weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a vice. In the days that followed, the remaining team members became hyper-aware of their surroundings. They knew bears were creatures of habit, territorial but also calculated in their responses. The technology they had once relied on so confidently now felt like a flimsy barrier between them and the raw power of the wilderness. Emma became more attuned to the patterns they had studied for so long. She could see the bears' behavior with new eyes, the way they marked their space, the subtle signals of irritation and threat they had overlooked. The ethical dilemmas they had once discussed in academic terms now loomed large and inescapable. They had come to study, to observe, to learn, but at what cost? Was the knowledge they sought worth the life it had claimed? Was their presence here, however noble the intent, justified when it had disrupted the delicate balance of the wild? Emma and Sophie finished their data collection in silence, each day heavy with the memory of what had happened. They knew they had to complete the mission if only to give meaning to David's sacrifice. But the exhilaration of discovery was gone, replaced by a sad understanding of the forces they had been up against. Sarah had always been captivated by the Earth. As an amateur geologist, her weekends revolved around exploring forests, examining rock formations, and unearthing traces of the planet's ancient history. The vast expanse of the local national park, known for its towering pines and rolling hills, intrigued her further. Locals whispered of hidden cave systems, largely unexplored and rich in minerals, an ideal setting for adventure. On a brisk autumn morning, Sarah set out early, her backpack stocked with essential gear: rope, water, a headlamp, a rock hammer, and snacks. The crisp air was fragrant with pine and damp soil. The trails wound around cliffs and through dense woods, where sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. She had no specific plan, only a vague hope of uncovering the region's geological secrets. After several hours of hiking, she spotted a narrow opening, half obscured by moss and vines, a barely visible cave entrance on the rocky hillside. Her heart raced. Local folklore suggested that such caves remained untouched due to their remote locations and challenging terrain. Excitement surged as she approached the entrance. After checking her gear, she stepped into the cool, damp darkness. Her footsteps echoed as the narrow passage widened into a larger chamber, where stalactites hung like jagged teeth. The walls shimmered faintly in her headlamp's beam, possibly minerals or something even rarer. For Sarah, this was a dream realized. She paused to examine the walls, tapping her rock hammer against promising spots. The sounds echoed hollowly in some areas, solid in others, hinting at an intricate cave system. As she ventured deeper, the cave twisted and turned, revealing wider chambers that felt untouched by time itself. Immersed in her exploration, she remained unaware that she was not alone. Unbeknownst to her, the cave had a resident. A grizzly bear, drawn to the cave's seclusion, had chosen it as its hibernation spot. Nestled deep within the cave system, far from the entrance where Sarah had begun her exploration, the bear lay in a deep sleep, its massive body tucked into a niche in the rock. For months it had been undisturbed, but now faint vibrations and the echoing taps of Sarah's rock hammer reached its sensitive ears. At first, the bear stirred only slightly, its subconscious mind picking up on the unusual sounds. But as Sarah continued to explore, moving closer to the bear's hidden den, the vibrations grew stronger. With a final abrupt disturbance, a loud crack as Sarah dislodged a piece of stone from the wall, the bear awoke. Confused, disoriented, and angry at the intrusion, it rose to its feet, its deep growl reverberating through the narrow tunnels. Sarah felt the shift before she heard it. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere. The air grew heavier and the silence became more oppressive. She paused, listening. Then the sound came, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down her spine. She turned her headlamp toward the source of the noise, but the tunnel ahead was dark, twisting and obscured by shadows. And then she saw it. The glint of movement, a massive shape emerging from the darkness. Her heart pounded as realization hit her. A grizzly bear, not just any bear, one that was now fully awake, fully aware, and clearly agitated by her presence. Panic surged through her, but instinct kicked in. She turned and ran, her boots scraping against the uneven stone floor. The bear, sensing her flight, gave chase, its powerful limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around her as she sprinted, the beam of her headlamp bouncing wildly. The roar of the bear filled the narrow tunnel, growing louder, closer, more menacing with each passing second. Sarah's thoughts raced as she tried to recall the path she had taken. The cave had been a maze of twists and turns, and now, with the adrenaline pumping through her veins, it was challenging to remember which way led to safety. Her legs burned with exertion, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed herself to keep moving. But the bear was relentless, its growls filling the cavern with an almost primal fury. The narrow passages that had once fascinated her now felt like a death trap. She stumbled over loose rocks, her hands scraping against the jagged walls as she struggled to maintain her balance. There was no time to stop, no time to think. Her only hope was to stay ahead, to find some way to lose the bear in the labyrinth of tunnels. But the cave had its dangers. As she turned a sharp corner, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She slipped, sliding down a steep incline, rocks tumbling around her as she fought to regain control. The bear was not far behind, its roars growing louder as it closed in. Sarah's slide ended in a small chamber, the walls closing in on all sides. She scrambled to her feet, searching for an escape, but the only way out was the way she had come in. The bear charged into the chamber, its massive frame filling the space. It snarled, its teeth bared, and for a moment Sarah was sure this was the end. But in a last, desperate move, she flung herself toward a narrow crack in the wall. It was barely wide enough to fit through, but she squeezed in, her body scraping against the stone as she forced her way through the tight space. The bear, too large to follow, slammed against the rock, its roars of frustration echoing in the small chamber. Sarah kept moving, crawling through the narrow tunnel until she finally emerged into a larger passage. She was battered, bruised, and exhausted, but alive. Hours later, she stumbled out of the cave, the sunlight blinding after the darkness. Her hands were shaking, her body trembling with the aftermath of the chase. The grizzly bear's roars still echoed in her mind, and as she looked back at the cave entrance, she knew she had narrowly escaped death. The excitement of discovery had faded, replaced by a deep respect for the raw power of nature and the dangers it held. In the weeks that followed, word of her ordeal spread. The park rangers closed off the cave, citing the dangers of disturbing the wildlife that called it home. The debate between exploration and preservation reignited, with many arguing that some places were better left undisturbed. As for Sarah, the experience had left her changed. She had ventured into the unknown and faced her fears, but the memory of the bear's pursuit served as a reminder that nature's secrets often came with a price. In a town nestled on the edge of the sprawling forest reserve, growth was seen as progress. Over the last decade, rows of newly built homes had replaced what was once quiet wilderness. Roads expanded, businesses flourished, and subdivisions sprawled toward the edge of the forest. But not everyone saw this as progress. In the shadows of the trees that bordered the town, creatures whose lives were tethered to the land watched the invasion unfold. Among them, a large black bear prowled, disturbed by the intrusion on its habitat. Its territory had shrunk, food sources dwindled, and unfamiliar smells filled the air. As the town expanded, the bear ventured closer to the edge, driven by hunger and confusion, crossing the invisible boundary between the forest and this new suburban landscape. The residents of the town had, for the most part, been unaware of the bear's presence. Most encounters with wildlife in the area were minor, occasional sightings of deer or the sudden flash of a fox darting across a road. But as the bear ventured further into human territory, the consequences began to escalate. It started innocuously enough, tipped over trash bins, broken fences, a fleeting shadow at the edge of the forest. But the bear, growing bolder, grew more aggressive in its search for food. One warm September night, the bear moved deeper into a neighborhood where kids played in manicured lawns and families gathered for evening barbecues. There, in the dark hours, it struck. Drawn by the scent of food, it tore into the back porch of the Johnston family's home. The bear smashed its way through the wooden boards, shredding the garbage cans and scattering their contents across the yard. The Johnstons were awakened by the loud noise, terror gripping them as the powerful creature rampaged through their property. It wasn't just the Johnston home. In the following days, other residents reported similar incidents. Windows broken, gardens trampled, pets threatened. Panic began to take root. The bear's increasing boldness unnerved the town, turning a community known for its proximity to nature into a place of fear. The town council convened, determined to find a solution. A group of residents were assembled to tackle the issue, representing different parts of the town's fabric. Among them were 4 individuals who would shape the course of the town's response. Emma Lyons, a wildlife conservationist who had long advocated for the preservation of Mendon Forest, found herself at odds with many in the room. Her deep knowledge of the forest's ecosystem made her a vital voice in the discussion. Still, her insistence on non-lethal methods of control put her at odds with the growing frustration among residents. She knew the bear's actions weren't malicious. They were a symptom of a larger issue, the town's relentless push into the bear's habitat. Then there was Greg Campbell, a father of 2 young children and a man deeply worried about their safety. His family home was close to the forest's edge, and the thought of a bear prowling nearby filled him with dread. He had little patience for talking about coexisting with wildlife. What he wanted was action, swift and decisive measures to protect his family and neighbors. His view mirrored that of many others in the community, driven by fear and the instinct to defend. Rebecca Crane, the owner of a local cafe in the town center, brought a different perspective. Her business relied on the town's thriving, nature-loving community. She believed that tourism and the town's identity were tied to its proximity to the forest. For her, the challenge wasn't just about safety, but also about preserving the unique relationship the town had with the wilderness. If they acted recklessly, that bond would be severed, taking with it the very thing that made the town unique. The final member of the group was Henry Webb, a seasoned trapper with decades of experience dealing with wildlife. His rough hands and weathered face told stories of countless encounters with bears, coyotes, and mountain lions. He had been called in to provide practical solutions. Henry wasn't driven by emotion, but by the complex reality of living alongside wild animals. He had seen what happened when wildlife was pushed too far, and he knew that the town was nearing that breaking point. Together, the group set out to create a plan, though tension simmered beneath the surface. While Emma advocated for creating wildlife corridors and better waste management to prevent further bear incursions, Greg argued for stronger fencing, enforcement, and, if necessary, lethal action. Henry remained pragmatic, suggesting that if the bear couldn't be relocated or dissuaded, more extreme measures would be needed. The bear continued to make its presence known. One afternoon, it wandered into a playground just as school was letting out. Though no one was harmed, the sight of the massive animal lumbering across the grass sent shockwaves through the community. That event proved to be the turning point, and the town council was forced to act quickly. They decided on a plan that balanced Emma's and Henry's approaches. Non-lethal traps baited with food were set in strategic locations around the neighborhood. The town ordered reinforced trash bins and established rules for securing garbage while warning residents to be vigilant. Emma worked with volunteers to create a more extensive buffer zone between the forest and the town, an effort to give wildlife space without venturing into human areas. The traps were set, and for days the town waited. The bear had become elusive, disappearing into the forest for longer stretches, but it was still there, a looming threat. Then, one morning, a trap was triggered. The massive bear, caught and sedated, was found in the backyard of the Westbrooks house, its large, dark eyes half closed as it succumbed to the tranquilizer. Henry arrived on the scene, his face unreadable as he checked the trap, ensuring the bear was unharmed. The bear was relocated deep into the forest, far from civilization, but the incident left a deep mark on the town. The residents had learned that their growth came at a cost, not just to the wilderness, but to themselves. While the immediate threat had been removed, the underlying issue remained. Emma's vision of wildlife corridors and coexisting solutions gained more traction as people began to understand the need for balance. A black SUV climbed steadily along the winding road, vanishing into the mist as it gained elevation. Inside, a group of high-powered executives from a chemical company sat among sleek leather seats, each cloaked in their sense of importance. They were headed to a corporate retreat designed to foster teamwork and strategic planning. Tension filled the air, with each executive harboring personal agendas, some seeking to climb the corporate ladder, others eager to assert their dominance. Little did they consider the surrounding wilderness, which was merely a backdrop for the business that would unfold over the weekend. The company was notorious for rapidly expanding into untouched territories, with its latest project encroaching on a pristine mountain region. For Thomas, the CEO, it was a reward for a successful year. For Rachel, the marketing director, it was an opportunity to maneuver through corporate politics. James, the CFO, sought allies for a risky financial strategy, while Elaine from HR aimed to reform the company culture. Their varied objectives concealed an impending threat. The first evening at the lodge revolved around superficial conversations and forced enthusiasm. A crackling fire illuminated the modern wooden interior, but few executives paid attention to the surrounding wilderness framed by glass walls. They were preoccupied with catered meals, fine wine, and fleeting moments where alliances could be forged or enemies undermined. The vibrant forest outside remained overlooked, a critical miscalculation that would soon prove fatal. As night fell, a grizzly bear began to stir in the area. Having recently emerged from hibernation, the bear was hungry and irritable. Typically, it kept to higher altitudes where human activity was minimal, but this year was different. Construction noise from the company's new developments had drawn the bear closer to the lodge, invading its previously undisturbed territory. The scent of humans and the strange sounds of machinery disturbed the creature, which now felt threatened in its own home. The following morning brought crisp air and a cloudless sky, as the team embarked on outdoor activities, split into smaller groups for team-building exercises. Joking about the absurdity of corporate bonding while scaling small cliffs, they remained oblivious to the growing agitation among the wildlife, broken branches, disturbed earth, and the unsettling silence of birds taking flight, signaling an impending confrontation. As the day wore on, Thomas pushed his group further up the trail. He wanted to demonstrate his leadership and show others that he was not just a figurehead, but someone capable of enduring hardship. They reached a rocky outcrop with a stunning view of the valley below. From this vantage point, the lodge looked insignificant, a tiny dot among the towering trees. Thomas felt a surge of power, a sense of control over everything in his purview. That was when the bear attacked. It happened so quickly that none of them fully grasped what was occurring, until it was too late. The bear, massive and enraged, barreled through the trees with terrifying speed. Its muscles rippled beneath thick fur as it charged, its breath heavy and raw. Thomas, standing nearest the trail's edge, barely had time to react before the bear swiped at him with one colossal paw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The others scattered in panic, their instincts for survival overpowering any corporate unity they had pretended to cultivate. The grizzly roared, a deep guttural sound that reverberated through the trees. Rachel stumbled, her foot catching on a root, while James and Elaine sprinted down the narrow trail. The beast's attention shifted momentarily, its wild eyes locking onto Rachel, who was closest to it now. She froze, paralyzed by the sheer size of the creature and the ferocity in its gaze. Before it could charge again, the loud crack of a branch drew its attention away, giving Rachel a chance to scramble toward the others. The group regrouped further down the trail, hearts pounding and minds racing. Thomas was bleeding, his face pale as he pressed a trembling hand to his side where the bear had struck. There was no time for blame or ego. At that moment, they were no longer executives. They were prey. The bear was relentless, pacing the edges of the trail, still watching them. They had intruded on its territory, and it had no intention of letting them go. Over the next few hours, the group stumbled through the forest, trying to stay ahead of the predator. But the terrain was unforgiving, and every movement felt agonizingly slow. Their expensive hiking gear and carefully planned retreats had done little to prepare them for the raw reality of survival. The bear continued to track them, appearing unexpectedly, driving them deeper into the forest. Their corporate titles and hierarchies dissolved as they faced the brutal truth of the situation. There was no escaping this. They had become part of the wilderness, and in the wilderness only the strongest survived. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The group huddled together in a small clearing, the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them. Thomas, usually so confident and commanding, was now weakened, his injuries making every breath a struggle. Rachel and James took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Elaine, who had spent much of her career advocating for empathy and humane practices within the company, felt the cruel irony of their situation. The wilderness did not care for their values or ideals. It was indifferent, its laws brutal and ancient. The following day, the bear's presence was felt once more. It had circled them through the night, and now it approached with renewed aggression. But this time, the team was prepared. They had gathered makeshift weapons, branches, rocks, anything they could use to defend themselves. They stood together, a far cry from the disconnected, power-hungry executives they had been just days before. Now they were a unified front determined to survive. The bear charged, and the struggle that ensued was savage. It clawed and swiped, but the team fought back, using their tools and their collective will to hold the beast at bay. It was a desperate primal battle, one that stripped away the last remnants of their corporate personas. When the bear finally retreated, wounded and snarling, they collapsed in exhaustion. By the time help arrived, summoned by emergency signals from the lodge, the team was a far cry from the polished executives who had first arrived. They had survived the wilderness, but it had left its mark on them. The corporate hierarchies that once felt so important now seemed trivial in light of their ordeal. The Grizzly attack forced them to confront their vulnerability and the arrogance of believing they could conquer the natural world without consequences. As they were airlifted from the forest, each one carried with them the realization that the world they had once controlled had fought back, irrevocably changing them in the process.